Walter Goldman was born and raised in a small town in southern Tennessee. By the time he turned 55 years old, he proudly considered himself a happy man who had achieved everything he wanted in life. Walter was a beloved husband, an adored father, and a wonderful grandfather. He lived in happy marriage with his wife Miranda for nearly 30 years. Of course, their life was full of both ups and downs, but they got through all the rough patches together. As befits a strong, loving family, Miranda worked as a nurse at the city hospital, and Walter spent his life working as a driver. The man used to drive a heavy trailer doing cargo transportation around the country, but now, due to his age, Walter switched to driving a cab. This way, he could spend more time with his family and grandchildren, who came to visit their grandparents almost every weekend. Walter's son, Spencer, was a middle-class manager, and by the time he was 30, he stood firmly on his feet and even bought a house. Many of Walter's colleagues were openly jealous of how wealthy his family was, and even asked him to share the secret of success. But Mr. Goldman just brushed them off, saying that all that anyone really needed to be happy was to love their wife and children. Walter was treated with utmost respect at the taxi service, and his vast experience was greatly appreciated, of course. Miranda often tried to convince her husband that it was time to quit his job and take care of himself. Walter sighed sadly in response and said, "I can't. I just can't live without all the roadsides, the noise of the engine, and the wrestling wheels on the road. I just got used to it over so many years." "I understand, dear. You're a great driver. Sometimes it seems that you and your Chevrolet are two parts of one whole," said Miranda, hugging her husband. The woman always took care of Walter, preparing delicious sandwiches for him to snack on and lovingly wrapping them in foil. It wasn't any different this time when Walter started his shift and went on an urgent call late in the evening. The man knew that the address was outside the city and therefore wanted to take a shortcut. He took a bypass road. Suddenly, someone got caught in the headlights of the man's Chevrolet. It was a little girl of about 5 or 6 years old. She was standing by the side of the road. The child, blinded by the bright light, closed her eyes and covered them with her hands. With a sinking heart, Walter stopped and jumped out of the car. "How did you end up here, honey? And why are you alone?" the man asked carefully, taking the girl by the hand. She looked at Mr. Goldman with a look full of sadness and desperation, and then sighed and simply shook her head. "You don't want to talk to me, or maybe you just can't talk?" asked Walter, who suddenly got an idea. The girl looked pretty attentively at the taxi driver and then nodded her head. "That's weird. Who could have left a little girl alone, especially at night?" thought Mr. Goldman worriedly. As if having read his thoughts, the child took a pen and a sheet of folded paper out of the side pocket. Then she looked hopefully in the eyes of the cab driver and handed him the note. Walter unfolded the paper and quickly read what was written on it. To the man's surprise, the note, full of grammatical errors, said that the girl should be taken to the hospital where her grandmother was getting treatment at. Seemed that the note was written by an illiterate person or a child who only knew how to print and didn't have the slightest idea about capital letters. Walter thought for a minute or two and then decided to take the girl wherever she needed to go. He felt very sorry for the child who was left all alone, especially in such a dangerous place as a road at night. When the girl was getting into the back seat of the car, Walter noticed that there was something wrong with her left hand, as if it had been injured recently. Okay, I'll take her to the hospital now, and then we'll figure out what to do. Next, Mr. Walter thought and started the engine. All the way to the hospital, the girl looked out at the window and behaved very calmly, only occasionally flinching when the car drove over a bump. It was obvious that the girl's hand was hurting, and more so whenever she tried to move it. When Mr. Goldman walked into the hospital with the girl, he ran into another problem. The problem was that Walter didn't know the name of the woman he needed to find. Realizing that the mute girl was unlikely to be able to help him, Mr. Walter tried to inquire at the front desk if a woman who looked like the girl's grandmother had been admitted recently. Fortunately, the nurse on duty felt bad for the girl, and having checked the journal, found out that only one woman, Oprah Patterson, who was admitted with a heart attack, could potentially be the girl's grandmother. Hearing the familiar last name, the girl nodded happily and even seemed to have forgotten about the pain in her hand. Meanwhile, the nurse seemed to hesitate for a moment, but then she asked Walter to step aside so they could talk without the girl. You see, Mr. Goldman, I don't know how to tell you, but the thing is, Oprah Patterson died 3 hours ago. That's an unexpected turn. What am I supposed to do now? Walter said, barely managing to keep his cool. Finally, having recovered from an initial shock, the man realized that he should first think about the girl and only then decide what to do with the grandmother. The nurse told Mr. Goldman that he needed to take her to pediatric trauma department. It looked like she might have a fracture, but she needed to get an X-ray to be sure. The nurse said, stroking the girl's head, since the girl could hardly stand on her feet. Walter picked her up and carried her to the car. When the cab driver brought the girl to the pediatric department, the doctors were shocked when they saw the X-ray results. The girl had a broken arm and numerous bruised ribs. It meant only one thing to Mr. Goldman. The girl needed to be admitted into the hospital so she could be under the supervision of doctors who could provide her with qualified assistance. Walter returned home late that night. His wife met him at the door and immediately told him with alarm in her voice, "Honey, what happened? You look so pale." After listening to her husband, Miranda Goldman couldn't hold back her tears, feeling sorry for the unfortunate girl, who by some fateful coincidence lost her grandmother and was hospitalized with a fracture, all in one day. It seemed to me that we need to help her. "Dear, I'll visit her tomorrow," said Miranda, looking hopefully into her husband's eyes. Miranda had right instinct, because it seemed that she literally read her husband's thought, who was about to suggest the same thing. So the next morning, Mr. and Mrs. Goldman went to the hospital. To the surprise of the Goldmans, the girl's attending physician greeted them with good news. You know what? It turns out that the girl wasn't mute. After all, she probably suffered some kind of psychological trauma, which caused a speech impediment. Of course, she still doesn't speak much, but the most important part is that she told us her name. "It's Hannah," said the elderly doctor, not taking his eyes off the happy couple. "It's a real miracle. When can we see her?" "We brought her some treats and toys," Miranda inquired cautiously. "Well, since you've been so kind, you can visit Hannah right now," the pediatrician replied with a smile. Seeing the man she knew the girl exclaimed happily, "Yay, the driver's here. I missed you." Tears filled Walter's and Miranda's eyes. The girl's voice was so loud that he too wanted to shout with joy at the top of their lungs. Hannah was very happy about the visit of Mr. Goldman and his wife, although the happiest Hannah was for the dolls that smart Miranda bought her that morning at a toy store. From that day on, the Goldman couple visited Hannah every morning and sometimes even several times a day. The Goldmans were very happy to see the joy in Hannah's eyes. She literally lit up every time they walked into her room. All this time, Walter was trying to figure out what had happened to the girl and her grandmother. The man turned to the police, who he told all the details of the evening when he found Hannah by the side of the road. During the investigation, it turned out that Hannah's grandmother, Oprah Patterson, was the one responsible for raising the girl. Hannah's parents had a gambling problem. They didn't have jobs and could disappear for days, and ends spending more time with the slot machines than their own daughter. Because of this, all the family money was spent on alcohol and to pay off numerous debts, which increased rapidly despite having health problems. Oprah Patterson gave all her life and attention to her little granddaughter up until her last breath. The unfortunate old lady was very sad that she had raised such an ungrateful daughter who didn't seem to care about anything except for alcohol and gambling. Since Hannah's parents didn't have a permanent place of residence, they often stayed at Mrs. Patterson's house, whose life was full of problems and worries even without the minute. Meanwhile, Brenda Patterson wasn't the least bit worried about the fate of her 5-year-old daughter, who was living from hand to mouth with her sick grandmother. The arrangement couldn't last forever, and so one day, Oprah Patterson had a heart attack. Complaining of a chest pain, the old woman called an ambulance with her last strength and lost consciousness. Little Hannah sat next to the motionless grandmother and cried all the time. Mr. Patterson's daughter was in the next room, but she didn't even come out when the paramedics arrived. When they took her grandmother to the hospital, Hannah realized that she couldn't stay in one house with her alcoholic mother and her friends, and the girl's father was already serving the second year of a sentence in the state county jail by the time. Hannah left the house late in the evening when her mother was drunk and sleeping on the sofa in the living room. The girl walked slowly down the street, not knowing where to go. There were very few passerby at the time of the day, so there was no one to help her. At some point, Hannah approached an old building. Its dilapidated walls and broken windows suggested that no one lived there for a long time. The girl's attention was attracted by the light coming from the basement of the house. Hannah came closer and, having stumbled on broken steps, fell down. Fortunately, the girl didn't have time to seriously injure herself, as the man who lived in the basement caught her in time. Upon seeing his clothes, Hannah realized that he was homeless. Despite his appearance, the man was nice and treated the girl to a sandwich and even gave her some tea. The homeless man noticed that Hannah had badly hurt her hand when she fell. He couldn't help but feel sorry for the girl and began to cry softly. When the girl warmed up a bit, the man wrote the very note that Walter Goldman read when he met the girl. It's hard to say how exactly the homeless man understood what Hannah needed. Maybe people in difficult situations understand each other without words, or maybe the girl managed to explain what she needed using gestures. Whatever it was with the note in her hands, little Hannah went to look for her grandmother without even the slightest hesitation. Having learned the story of the girl he saved, the cab driver Walter Goldman couldn't hold back his tears. He couldn't understand how Hannah's own mother could treat her daughter so inhumanly. Having told his wife everything, Walter looked up inquiringly into her eyes. "Yes, I know what you want to ask, dear. I was thinking the same thing. After all, we aren't that old yet. You want to go get custody over Hannah. Am I right, Miranda?" said, wiping away a tear that was flowing down her face. Having gotten yet another proof of the perfect understanding between him and his wife, Walter hugged her and kissed her tenderly. It should be said that the Goodmans did just as they intended and got the approval of the social services to adopt Hannah. A few months later, Hannah was already playing happily with her Goldman's grandchildren, who quickly accepted the little girl. Of course, it was hard for Miranda and Walter to figure out their relationship with Hannah, who were their father and a mother, or maybe grandparents. One thing they did know, for sure, they would love Hannah until their very last breath. After all, the Goodmans have already believed that a happy family is one that is full of cheerful children's laughter. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe to Inspire Ripples for more stories.